Hi, David.
Hello, Bob.
How are you?
I am good.
Good. Thanks for joining us on Meaning of Life TV, and
Absolutely.
more specifically on the Wright Show. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. You're David Sloan Wilson, noted biologist at Binghamton University. You are possibly best known for in explaining human altruism, emphasizing group selection more than maybe some biologists have in the past. But we'll talk a little bit about that later, and about what group selection is for the uninitiated.
Sure.
But and we'll also talk about various other places where evolution intersects with the meaning of life, I guess. I wanted to start out by asking you about this thing you run called the Evolution Institute, which has a website called This View of Life. That phrase, of course, comes from the closing section of Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, where he says, there is grandeur in this view of life.
Exactly.
And was the name of Stephen Jay Gould's famous column in Natural History for a long time. What kinds of questions are you looking into there?
Well, there's three levels of evolutionary theory, as you know. One is in the biological sciences, and there it is the theory for the biological sciences. Then it's in relation to human affairs, and for complex reasons, that's been delayed, basically. So applying evolution to human-related topics such as religion is something which has really only taken place in a mature form very recently. And then there is applying it in a practical sense, not just for academic understanding, but to actually, improve the quality of life. Not just understand the human condition, but to improve it. And that's what the Evolution Institute is. It's the first think tank to formulate public policy from an evolutionary perspective. So we think hard about what all think tanks think about. Mm-hmm. Economics, policy issues such as education, urban revitalization, you name it, you can study it from an evolutionary perspective, just like in the biological sciences. So this, to me, is the most exciting, that you can take this theory that's been shown to be so powerful in the understanding nature, and to not only understand human nature, but also to actually make a positive difference in the real world.
Okay, so just to be clear, of the three things you described, the Institute is focused on the third, or the second and the third?
Really the second and the third,
okay.
Because it does academic projects. Peter Turchin's excellent work on world history, for example, to create a database for world history, is an example of the academic end of the Evolution Institute. And then on the applied end, we're using the science of cooperation, creating a platform called ProSocial, that any group can actually get trained in the core design principles, as Eleanor Ostrom called them, for improving the efficacy of groups. So you can make your group stronger, and we'll help you do so.
Oh, good. I'd like to have a strong group. How is a database about world history evolutionary?
Well, it's cultural evolution. I think Nonzero.
Yeah. So by cultural evolution, we mean the transmission, basically, of non-genetic information from human to human in a way that builds up bodies of information, science, technology, religion, and really attendant changes in social structure and everything. It's everything we've kind of made of the world via, in one sense or another, communication, you might say.
Yeah, and one of the things that everyone needs to know is that there's more to evolution than genetic evolution. Mm-hmm. Darwin knew nothing about genes. For him, evolution was variation, selection, and heredity. But evolutionary theory became very gene-centric in the 20th century, and this is something we have to expand beyond. And what cultural evolution is, this is another one of these things that's only a few decades old, despite the fact that evolutionary theories over 150 years old, actually studying cultural evolution as an evolutionary process with its own inheritance system is only coming into its own within the last 20 years. And names such as Peter Richardson and Robert Boyd and Peter Turchin and Joseph Henrich, these are some of the names of people that are actually studying it quite formally. A great book, let me mention, is Evolution in Four Dimensions by Eva Jablonka and Miriam Lamb, saying basically there's four inheritance mechanisms at least: genetic evolution, epigenetics, the kind of social learning found in many species, and then the kind of symbolic thought that is distinctively human. And each one provides a mechanism by which information is transmitted across generations, so that offspring resemble parents. That's what heritability is.
Yeah. Some people may be familiar with the final chapter of Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, in which he coined the term meme, which has come to mean different things, but originally it meant just a generic kind of unit of cultural information. So it could be a tune you hear, could be a scientific theory, could be a sentence, I guess, could be a word, and that was one of the early kind of modern incarnations of drawing pretty strict parallels between cultural evolution and genetic evolution. There was in anthropology in the early and mid 20th century, and even before that, probably, a school of cultural evolutionism that probably wasn't as rigorous in comparing cultural to biological evolution as you would like. It fell out of favor in anthropology, partly for being so directional.
That's right. I mean, the reason that the current manifestation is so new is not because it was ignored until now. It's because there were many attempts, or earlier attempts, that went wrong in one way or another. And so the progressive idea of cultural evolution, the idea that it's a linear progression from savages to civilization, was one early attempt. Social Darwinism, most people associate that with the moral justification of inequality, so that was another thing that happened. And then there were more attempts than that. So I think that a scholarly understanding of this is very important, and it's one of the things that we're doing at This View of Life. We're going to have a whole series of articles called Truth and Reconciliation for Social Darwinism, just so that we could actually unpack all of these things that did take place. But the bottom line is that, as you know, there was a kind of an apartheid that got formed, so that the study of human culture and behavior became more or less divorced from biology for the most part. And so that's what's now is becoming reintegrated, basically. And why? And when we get to Dawkins's concepts of memes, let me say two things. One is, yeah, I mean, that was a great event, basically, in getting people thinking about cultural evolution. And we do need a word for cultural traits, so let it be memes, that's fine. But in some respects, the study of memes didn't progress very far for a number of reasons. And some of the things associated with memes, I think, have proven to be not exactly wrong, but not very general. For example, to think about cultural traits in an atomistic sense, to think about cultural traits as primarily parasitic is...
yeah, that was a thing he emphasized. The idea that, like, when you remember a song, you can think of that as the song parasitizing your brain, which I thought kind of biased the question of whether the song turned out to be good for you or bad for you. It could go either way.
Well, it could, and he would say that. So I'm familiar with this literature, and so it's just like genes. I mean, all of this is parallel with genes. So, there's some sense in which the gene and the meme is the fundamental unit of selection, but nevertheless, genes and memes can evolve by helping individuals, by helping groups, or by just helping themselves. I mean, it's the whole meme concept is basically a carbon copy of the gene. The selfish gene concept.
Right. So one more question about what you're up to at the Institute. When you say you're actually formulating public policy or recommending public policy or something, I guess there's various ways an evolutionary worldview could feed into that. I assume one of them is just thinking about how evolved human nature, as studied in evolutionary psychology, is or isn't very compatible with various alternative policies. Is that one thing you're up to?
Sure. Yeah. And in fact, we're doing a series on evolutionary psychology, which is exactly that theme. And so mismatched theory, basically, the idea that we're a product of evolution, and but we're living in a completely different environment. that is one very important theme, and yet at the same time, it has to share time with almost the opposite theme, which is, of course, is that thanks to cultural evolution, we adapt rapidly to our current environments. So it's not as if, the strict version of evolutionary psychology, in which all of our adaptations were kind of cut during the Stone Age.
And we should tell people what adaptations are, right? They're basically, you could think of them as traits that are with us because of a function they serve or served in the past, features of us that are in some metaphorical sense designed by natural selection.
Right. Exactly. And so what cultural evolution does is it adds a layer of rapid adaptation to the layer of slower adaptation of genetic evolution, which, by the way, isn't necessarily slow. One of the great developments is the discovery that genetic evolution can be a very fast process. It can take place in just a few generations. So genetic evolution hasn't stopped. In some ways, it's going faster. And at the same time, cultural evolution can be a fast process. Sometimes it's a slow process. It can take centuries and millennia. Yeah. So there's an overlap between the rates of genetic and cultural evolution, and they co-evolve with each other. So it's a very complicated scenario.
Right, because cultural evolution can change the environment in which genetic evolution is happening. Just to revisit one interesting phrase, you mentioned mismatch theory. That's kind of the interesting idea that, as you suggested, we evolved by and large, notwithstanding what you said about how fast evolution can happen, by and large, human nature, the bulk of human nature, evolved in something like a hunter-gatherer environment, certainly an environment that's not like, it is in many ways different from 21st century America. And the idea there is that, when an environment is very different from the environment you evolved in, it can, cause problems for the organism. So I think, for example, this is one explanation for why, I'm not really up on the recent literature, but it used to be said that in hunter-gatherer environments, you find bipolar depression, like manic depression, but you don't find unipolar depression. And the thinking was that was, in other words, where you have these depressive states that are not counterbalanced by a manic phase, and then the thinking was that might be a product of the kind of seclusion and loneliness you can find in a modern environment that's really very hard to find in a hunter-gatherer environment. But that's, at any rate, an example. Certain anxiety disorders would be another example of mismatch theory.
And so there are a couple things to say about that. There's a kind of a grain problem. Some things are more likely than others, more easy to establish than others. And I think that one thing that's easy to establish is that the ancestral social environment was a small group environment. Mm-hmm. So that means that the small group is a kind of a fundamental unit of human social organization, which by itself is an interesting observation, because that is not a part of mainstream economic theory, not nearly. So right there you have an insight, basically, that you can start working on. Now, when you have a very specific hypothesis, like bipolar depression existed here and not there and so on, that's much more specific and starts out being very speculatory. So as you know, the accusation that evolutionary theorizing is just like Kipling's Just So stories is made again and again and again. But I think that's really a cheap shot, because a Just So story is an untested hypothesis, and all hypotheses start out untested.
Right.
So and then you have to do the hard work of testing the hypotheses. If that never happens, and if it remains an untested hypothesis, well, then the Just So story accusation is warranted. But in most cases, we're working pretty hard at unraveling these very interesting theories. And it's just a very exciting time. I think we're living in very exciting intellectual times.
Yeah. I mean, there is something distinctively challenging about testing a theory about a biological adaptation, because you can't just rerun evolution again exactly as it was, and switch a few variables 100 million years ago. So you can't do the thing that's strictly comparable to a controlled experiment in physics. But I would just say, one thing, that accusation is often leveled against evolutionary psychology, and it's true that there are challenges here, but those challenges apply equally to all of evolutionary biology. So when I say polar bears are white because the white allows them to blend in with the snow, nobody gets upset about that, even though I'm just throwing it out there. And there's some reason to believe, because there's a correlation. Yeah, white bears tend to live around the snow. That adds some, credence to credibility to the hypothesis, but it's kind of only in the realm of evolutionary psychology where people get upset about the challenges of corroborating a theory. They don't so much in the rest of biology. I mean, a few people do, and in defense of Stephen Jay Gould, whom I've often criticized, he actually used to criticize both evolutionary biology and what became evolutionary psychology. Anyway, they face the same challenge.
Yeah, and so I think that this is another thing that, any historical science is faced with this problem: geology, astrology, and also crime detection. I mean,
I think you mean astronomy, not astrology, but
yes,
in any
astronomy.
event.
Thank you.
Astrology faces problems too, but they're different problems.
And also human history, criminology. We can infer the past, and sometimes we can infer it amazingly well. So let's roll up our sleeves, basically, and get to it, rather than just griping about just those stories.
So I would like to talk about this idea you're interested in, it's about meaning systems. You in an email, you wrote a little about those in an email to me, and I'm sure you've written about it elsewhere. And there was a sentence that interested me. You said, "Thus, we need to create meaning systems that are highly respectful about the facts and explicit about the values. Such a meaning system will be the first of its kind in human history." I'm not sure that's true, and I think I'm going to challenge you on that. But first, why don't you explain to us what you mean by meaning systems?
Great. And so let me begin with religion, a topic which captivates the scientific imagination because it seems so irrational. And so it's so puzzling to us why people seem to believe in such weird things that have no proof, and why it causes them to do such costly things. And you know this topic well from your book. I know it well from
I wrote a book called Darwin's Cathedral that's about religion from an evolutionary point of view.
And your book, The Evolution of God. And so the big puzzle, all the way back to the first scholars to study this, Durkheim and Fraser and people like this, was, in the first place, can we explain it as something that's not useful but nevertheless persists? That's one major possibility. Or can we explain it as something that's useful after all? Okay? And Durkheim was the person who said that despite appearances, religions, most enduring religions, have great secular utility. Okay? That was his phrase, which I repeat again and again. And I think the contribution of evolutionary science, the people that have been working on this for only since the turn of the 21st century, is to actually build up a case for the functionality of religion. Although, like with many adaptations, and of course religion is not just one adaptation, it's a collection, it's a very fuzzy set, a collection of many adaptations. And so you'll find examples of all kinds, byproducts, mismatches, so on and so forth. But if you could say one thing about religions, is that primarily they're a collection of culturally evolved traits that create community, that are real good at creating community. Mm-hmm. And counterfactual beliefs that are have no factual evidence, mm-hmm. Play an important role because, and this is one of the first things you can say as an evolutionary biologist, that to explain the whole nature of beliefs, human beliefs from an evolutionary perspective, presumably they exist on the basis of what they cause people to do, not on the basis of their truth content.
Right.
So all beliefs need to be evaluated by two criteria. A, how factual are they? Do they describe something that's out there? B, what do they cause you to do?
Mm-hmm. And if I can just pause and zoom in on that a little. I don't think what you're not saying, I think, is that we are born with specific beliefs hardwired by natural selection, such as oak trees produce acorns or something. But I think you are saying, and if you're not, I'll say it because I believe it, that in a broad sense, to the extent that natural selection built brains that incline us to believe certain kinds of things, it built us to believe those things because they made us do things that in turn led to the propagation of genes, right? So where the rubber meets the road is in the behavior that the beliefs would cause, or the kinds of beliefs we're drawn to and find attractive. And one reason this is interesting is because what we're saying is, strictly speaking, the brain is not designed to perceive the truth. It's designed to perceive and believe things that are conducive to genetic replication.
Well, yeah, I have to amend just a couple of those. One is ease off on genetic replication, because once we have different modes of inheritance,
sure,
then which is leading which is whether these things are contributing to cultural fitness or genetic fitness. Not everything has to be, I mean, the whole apparatus of cultural evolution evolved by genetic evolution. Yes, that's true.
Right.
But at the same time, as its own system, then there's many traits that are favored by cultural evolution, and which do not increase genetic fitness.
That's absolutely true. Although, in an ongoing way, these cultural beliefs, there are constraints imposed by the brain, I would say, and the brain was built by natural selection.
And so that actually brings us to the other point: are these genetically innate or not? And the answer is kind of both, in an interesting way. And one example, for example, is the psychology of us-them thinking. The fact that we're so primed to think a certain way about members of our groups and another way about members of other groups, especially opposing groups. There's a lot of innateness in that. I mean, that just didn't get, you can't attribute all of that to cultural evolution. There's basically a lot of preparedness, genetic preparedness.
Right. Although the definition of the group seems to be pretty fluid. In other words,
totally fluid.
In other words, it's not like we're designed to think that to always oppose groups whose members have different color skin. You all the time you'll see a fight break out between two athletic teams, both of which are racially integrated. So there's a fluidity to the definition of groups, but I think almost everyone would agree that the psychological predispositions to be groupish seem to have some basis, firm biological basis.
Yeah, and you can say the same thing for disgust, where, I mean, we have a disgust response, but we're very fluid in what we regard as disgusting. So it's the same kind of story. There's a biological preparedness, but then there's a lot of flexibility into how and when it's triggered.
Okay.
So what we've done now is we've made a very interesting distinction between practical and factual realism, as two terms that I often used, and then we've noted that we're designed mostly to accept beliefs on the basis of their practical realism, not their factual realism. And the relationship between the two is complex. There's some situations in which there's a positive relationship between practical and factual realism. In other words, the more clearly we see the facts, the more adaptively we behave. Okay? If I'm a hunter, I need to know the exact location of my prey in order to be a successful hunter. But there's other cases in which there's a negative relationship, and beliefs that are flagrantly untrue, nevertheless, cause us to behave in ways that are adaptive. And so now religion is looking pretty explicable from an evolutionary perspective, and the scientist or the rationalist who scratches his or her head and says, I don't understand why we believe all these goofy things. Well, that's a pretty goofy thing to say from an evolutionary perspective. These factually incorrect beliefs are easy to understand on the basis of what they cause people to do. And that's a big advance, basically. I mean, maybe people speculated about that in the past. Maybe that's what Durkheim claimed. But we can show it. There's been enough good science that's taken place. That's not a just so story anymore. So that's an accomplishment.
Okay, so I steered you over to this issue of the kinds of things we're inclined to believe as you were marching us through this exposition of meaning systems.
Yeah, so now I want to go from religions to meaning systems. and to say that what we've just noted for religions are true for all cultural systems. It's true of a secular cultural system. If you're not religious, you still have a whole set of beliefs and practices which basically inform your action. I describe a meaning system as a cultural system that takes environmental information as input and results in action as output. Mm-hmm. And so not everyone is religious, but everyone has a meaning system. Every normal human has a meaning system.
And you also describe them as, I think, like cultural brains for groups. So in other words, there are, I'm not sure if that's exactly the way you put it, but the idea is there are these shared meaning systems. Meaning systems tend to be shared among some definable group of people.
Right.
And the meaning system influences the behavior, including sometimes the collective behavior, I guess, of the group.
Exactly. So when I define a meaning system as a system that takes in information as input and results in action as output, people say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Well, that is literally the definition of a brain, isn't it?
Yeah.
So to say that a meaning system, a cultural meaning system, is the brain of a group actually takes you into very, very interesting territory about the concept of society as an organism, group minds, all of these things that seem like science fiction. Actually, this is actually where the science is taking us. And that is, what could be more exciting than that?
Yeah, okay. So science is an example of one of these meaning systems, I think you say. And more than most meaning systems, it's devoted to the in some sense the truth. In other words, weeding out ideas that don't have a factual basis, right?
Yes, that's right, and that's why I think it's justifiable to say that a meaning system. So what we have said is that basically factual realism is subordinated to practical realism in most meaning systems of the past. I want to stress that religions are not special that way, and that if you look at meaning systems which are not religious, they are shot through with falsehoods. If you look at patriotic histories of nations, mm-hmm. Any belief about tribal people, about themselves and others, you'll find that all meaning systems prior to the advent of science, which is what that is a meaning system that it explicitly places its value, its God essentially, is factual realism.
And it's interesting. It's interesting how impervious some of these counterfactual beliefs are to actual evidence. I mean, what I'm thinking of is that in any given country, you can find a lot of smart people extolling the unique virtues of the countries. Now, countries do have unique properties and sometimes unique virtues, and I suppose in the case of American exceptionalism, which is what I was kind of thinking about,
yes,
there is the fact that America has, it does have some distinctive properties. It's been the most powerful country in the world for some time. That's different. And it was early into the democracy game and so on. There's a lot of things you can say. At the same time, it just amazes even me sometimes, and as you know, I acknowledge the brain's power to mislead. It amazes even me to see how many intelligent people, it seems to me, in America who are like, these are commentators who are influencing policy, who just seem incapable of looking at things from the point of view of anybody other than an American.
Yeah, well, and you could probably include you and me in that.
Well, yeah, but I work hard. You're right.
It's just going to take 50 or 100 years to reveal itself. The way we look back at the Victorian era, and we see that one reason that evolution applied to human affairs went so wrong is because it was seen through the lens of the Victorian culture. Nobody back then, it was just the air that they breathed,
right,
to think that European culture was superior to other cultures and so on and so forth. No one was immune from that. So I think there's some things that no one is immune from And now when you look at our own culture, and especially the rampant individualism of the last half century or more, and if you start looking at current economic theory, for example, as a case where, oh boy, I mean, we could have a whole separate session on this, but the falsehoods that are inherent in some of our modern ideologies and is frightening, because it's basically a form of fundamentalism, and which nobody sees, mm-hmm. because it masquerades for the truth better than our religious beliefs. With religious beliefs, you're kind of expecting it to be false, mm-hmm. but not with our beliefs about ourselves and our societies and economies and so on.
So, are you interested in kind of dispelling these, I don't know what these group-centric delusions? Is that part of your mission? Or do you think sometimes you may think that sometimes they have a productive role to play and lead to behaviors that don't come at the expense of other groups or something? But is this higher on your agenda to kind of influence the tendency of people to be blinded by group identity?
Well, again, it's complicated. So let me try to do it in stages. One point is that for science, it's enormously important to solve the problems of our age. So we're not going to solve the problems of our age if we don't have scientific understanding. So we need to have a belief system which is very highly respectful of science, or of factual reality, more than ever before. Point one. Point two. That's not good enough, because science doesn't have values, basically. So knowing the facts of the world does not actually tell you what to do. That's what the naturalistic fallacy is all about, basically, is that facts have to be combined with values in order to result in action. And
so like, even if science tells you this drink is poison, that by itself does not lead you to not drink the poison. You have to add a value judgment to that. In this case, like, I value my life. That's the idea, right? That a scientific proposition by itself, strictly speaking, never compels behavior.
That's exactly right. And to say otherwise is called the naturalistic fallacy. So, and so what that means is that we need to have a set of values that we use to consult the facts, but we have to separate them more than ever before, because what most meaning systems do is they mix up values as facts. Basically, the values are masquerading as facts, and so there needs to be a separation of values and facts in a future meaning system. But then finally, and this gets us back to mismatch and the fact that we are products of evolution. We'll never get away from the fact that we're storytelling animals, and we think in terms of narratives and so on. And so at the end of the day, there has to be some sense in which this can be communicated in a fashion that it is psychologically compelling to us. Some of my associates call this the mythic magic mode, basically. You know, let there be stories and heroes and myths and battles and so on and so forth, because that's just the way we think. So somehow we have to have great stories, we have to be respectful of facts, and we have to be explicit about values. That's what we have to do.
Okay, so let me tell you what I was going to challenge about the sentence of yours I read. You said, thus we need to create meaning systems that are highly respectful about the facts. In other words, consistent with science and even informed by it, maybe. And explicit about the values. Such a meaning system will be the first of its kind in human history. Now, what I was going to say was, well, what about something like utilitarianism? It makes the value judgment that human happiness is good and that no individual human is more important, no individual's welfare is more important than another person's welfare. And then from there, it constructs a whole system, none of which I think is consistent with science. And I think it's in addressing specific issues, the utilitarian would take science into account. So are you going to say the problem with utilitarianism is that it's not sufficiently motivated because it doesn't have stories or myths or something, or what?
Well, in the first place, I'll back off. So I'll take your point, and I'll back off my claim that it will be the first in human history. I think utilitarianism has has its problems as a philosophical position.
Mm-hmm.
So that as you work on the concept of morality, what is morality, then it's another thing that you've thought deeply about, is that we're going to come to the conclusion that it's not maximizing the amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. That's misconceived in some sense. And one of the things it does is it mixes up proximate and ultimate causation in evolutionary terms. But I'll back off your claim. I mean, in some ways, the Enlightenment was an attempt to create such a value system. Fine. I shouldn't claim uniqueness. That was a bad rhetorical.
But you are working towards something that would fit this description, a meaning system that accommodates science and defers to science, but adds enough in the way of values to motivate behavior.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want to. It's this is what needs to be done, basically, and so I think many people would agree with that. But I think that it can be. We can sharpen its focus, basically. I think that when we approach the human condition from an evolutionary perspective, I think, and we get a better idea what religion is, what cultural systems are, what meaning systems might be,
mm-hmm.
the distinction between practical and factual realism, why it is we so easily believe in falsehoods. All of these, I think, lead to a conclusion that other people might have reached, but in a bit more of a compelling
mm-hmm.
way, basically. It's a little bit more clear-cut that we need this.
It is an interesting question, if you try to create a highly kind of motivational meaning system, you might say. I mean, I know in your definition all meaning systems are in some sense motivational, but if you want a system that goes beyond, say, positing utilitarianism and wants to actually motivate people to live their lives according to it, in accordance with it, or in accordance with some other thing, it's an interesting question what you have to add, or how you can add things that have real motivational power that don't involve false claims.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's like a handicap, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You're handicapping yourself because you can't make false claims. And think of all the things you can't do.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, there's a bunch of things you can do. And I've just recently started to hang out with some people that call themselves interspiritualists.
I saw your interview with, what was that guy's name? Kurt Johnson.
Yeah, this is a very recent acquaintance, but one that I'm very excited about. And the story is that, as you know from the interview available on This View of Life, is that just about any contemplative tradition, no matter what the religious tradition is, especially the contemplative and monastic elements of those religions, all come to the conclusion of interconnectedness, basically, that everything is interconnected. And so therefore, and so does science, by the way. And so therefore, is there a meaning system that can be founded on interconnectedness, which can be 100% methodological naturalism, basically,
mm-hmm.
And still be highly motivating? And if so, then that could result in a convergence of religious traditions
mm-hmm.
and with science. So how can we make a compelling meaning system out of interconnectedness? Can we? And so that is what that movement represents. And I think that sometimes it seems a little new agey, but no, not the way I described it. So I'm very interested in it.
It is interesting. I mean, the apprehension in these mystical experiences is one that, in a sense, breaks down the bounds of the self. Now, in Buddhism, this is sometimes described as like a not self experience, and the idea that self doesn't exist. In Hinduism, on the other hand, it's more like union between the self and like the cosmic soul or something, the universe. And then in Abrahamic religions, it might be union with the divine out there or whatever. So the specifics differ, but there is a sense of closer interconnection to the whole or something in some sense that I do think is common to a lot of these tradition, and that tends to be motivating in itself. I mean, it is, you often find people who say they have become more altruistic, more considerate by virtue of having this apprehension that the wall separating them and the other person is actually in some sense not there. Now that is, of course, just a subjective apprehension. It's not like a scientific fact. I mean, there are scientific facts about forms of interconnection and interdependence that characterize the world, but those are slightly different, right?
Well, yes and no. What Kurt says in his interview is that for anyone who takes this on, who appreciates it, this great interconnectedness, then that does have ethical consequences, even in a purely scientific sense. What if your appreciation of interconnectedness is purely scientific, but nevertheless you're trying to do something and to have it have beneficial consequences? Well, you're just realizing the interconnectedness. Then there's some things that you're not going to do that you might have done otherwise if you had more of a partitioned meaning system. So ethical consequences flow from an understanding of interconnectedness. Now, whether that's a scientific understanding or an experiential understanding, something that you get more viscerally and emotionally, this is where the mythic magic element might come into it. It might be that just because we're human beings, that we need to appreciate interconnectedness with more than our frontal cortex, basically. So in that case, then we'd want to have other kinds of experiences, basically, that bring home this feeling of interconnectedness.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about this. I think there may be some differences, at least, between the implications of the observed interconnectedness, scientifically observed interconnectedness, and the experiential version. And I think the experiential version might tend to lead to more some of us might call more purely moral behavior, meaning basically a more diffuse altruism. I mean, it's certainly true at a minimum that if you understand that an economic crisis half the world away can spread to your country, or disease half the world away, or for that matter, hatred of America half the world away, can come back to haunt you, then on strictly selfish grounds, you might take an interest in the welfare of people half the world around. But certainly the experiences of interconnection tend to go beyond that whole self-centered premise of the calculation I just described, right? Now, there's separately an awareness of your interconnection in the sense of your influence, the way you are influencing other people half the world around. And if you start with an altruistic premise, a premise of concern for their welfare, that might inform your behavior. But I do think there may be some distinctions here. Well,
so let me make 2 quick points. One is, this is a big part of my new book, Does Altruism Exist? Mm-hmm. And that's very much to do with the distinction between proximate and ultimate causation. There's many ways to skin a cat, and there's many ways to motivate behavior that's altruistic, defined in terms of action, basically helping behavior. One is like psychological altruism. I want to help you because that's my goal, to help you. That's my final goal. The other is enlightened self-interest. I want to help you because I see that it's in my enlightened self-interest. If those cause you to do the same thing, then that's just 2 ways to skin a cat, and there's really no reason to privilege one over another. And I think one reason that the literature on altruism is problematic is that there's a privileging of proximate mechanisms. We say this way of thinking is altruistic, that way isn't. And I want to say, I don't care. That's like you offering to pay me by cash or check. I want to know, am I going to be paid? And so we shouldn't be privileging one proximate mechanism over another. All proximate mechanisms need to be evaluated in terms of what they cause people to do. And so this results in a kind of a pluralism of motives that we should appreciate.
Okay. And just to clarify the distinction between proximate and ultimate, you might say, what is the proximate cause of your having rendered assistance to that person? And I might say, well, I felt sorry for them. I felt compassion. That caused me to do it. And then a biologist might say, well, okay, but the ultimate cause is because in the evolutionary past, feeling that kind of compassion and helping another person in comparable circumstances led your genes to get into the next generation or something. So I think originally Aristotle's distinction maybe between proximate and ultimate cause, right? And it's certainly true that like you run into trouble from people who you explain certain kinds of altruism in evolutionary terms, and they say, well, then it's not altruism. And I'm like, well, define it any way you want. I mean, now there are, at the same time, there are cases where the ultimate evolutionary explanation, which ultimate evolutionary explanation you choose, will change your conception of what kind of altruism, under what circumstances altruism will actually be forthcoming. And that leads us, we don't have time to do a seminar on group selection, but it does lead us to this thing that you're well known for, which is emphasizing, putting particular emphasis in explaining altruism on what's called group selection. And I think maybe we should see if we can get away with not even explaining group selection, but my asking you, what difference does it make in terms of the kinds of altruism you would expect to see, whether you attribute power to group selection or just what's called individual selection?
Yeah, well, that's such a big topic that actually invite me back on your show.
Okay.
Do a whole thing on
okay.
Because I want to make another point, which is that when we think of these meaning systems, such as interspirituality,
mm-hmm.
Let's say that they get you to really appreciate interconnectedness, and on that basis, you become a very altruistic person in what you do. You don't do things just for yourself anymore. You really have the whole society in mind, let us say, okay? Now, that's not good enough in the sense because you're never going to get everyone to act that way. And so there's always going to be something else that you have to do, which is to create a social environment that protects good behaviors, basically, and prohibits, in one way or another, more selfish behaviors, regardless of how you think about it. You need to have what game theory provides, basically. You need to have punishment, you need to have exclusion, there has to be a social environment that
so it could be a legal system of sanctions, like putting people in jail. It could be a moral system of sanctions, like not inviting people to parties if they violate social
norms and all of that. And that's another thing about religion. They don't just tell you to turn the other cheek. They're bristling with social control mechanisms that so that people who are not behaving for the good of the group, it's consequential, basically. They will be punished, excluded, whatever. And so I had a conversation with the moral philosopher Simon Blackburn, and I said, before we talk about evolution of morality, just define morality for me, will you? And he said there's two sides to morality. There's a kind of a coercive side. You're expected to do things, and if you don't do them, there'll be trouble. And then there's the genuinely other-oriented side. I help you because I want to help you. And these are like two sides of the same coin. And I think evolution makes it exceptionally clear why those two sides have to exist. Because if you didn't have the coercive side, then the genuinely other-oriented side would just get creamed in competition with more selfish behaviors. So
extend that thought a little. So you're saying, I mean, certainly altruism can evolve genetically prior to any coercive mechanism, right? I mean, if you take the kin-selected altruism, where I love my offsprings and to a lesser but significant extent my siblings and so on, that evolves. Feels like altruism leads me to help vehicles that are carrying my genes. Now that doesn't require a flip side, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. So let me just unpack that.
Okay.
So the general statement that you can make about altruism, by which we means behaviors that help others at a cost to yourself, is that for it to evolve, there has to be some way that altruists restrict their interactions to each other, basically, and avoid the depredations of selfish individuals, okay? Now, with kin selection, that happens for free, because when you're interacting with a genetic relative, and if altruism has a genetic basis, that creates a kind of a clustering automatically so that altruists are more likely to interact with other altruists than by chance, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so kin selection provides this clustering mechanism without coercion, so you're right about that. Now when we go to human social interactions, and so there's some very interesting recent science on this showing that in those hunter-gatherer societies, our best approximation of our ancestral social environment, actually the average degree of relatedness among members of a group was pretty darn low.
Huh.
We weren't just hanging out with our full siblings. So basically, you're not getting the clustering that you would have with interaction among close genetic relatives, and it's therefore then that you need to have something else which comes in, and that something else is such things as norms enforced by punishment and so on and so forth.
Or even enforced by you. I mean, when it's a reciprocal relationship, if somebody stops being nice to you, you stop being nice to them.
Totally. The two-person game theory is a perfect little microcosm of it. Or it could be there's some very interesting class of models called walkaway models. It's basically a model of friendship. So let's say that individuals differ in how nice they are. They all get to know each other, and then the nice ones go off with each other, and they leave the other ones in the lurch. So there's a clustering that takes place that way, which has nothing to do with genealogical relatedness. Nobody was genealogically related, but the nice ones were able to find each other and were able just to restrict their interactions with each other. That can be more powerful than kin selection as a clustering mechanism. So friendship, why are friends nice for that reason?
Okay. All right. So is there anything... So I think it may make sense to reserve a full-fledged discussion of altruism, especially in the context of group selection, for another conversation. But is there anything you want to say quickly about your new book, Does Altruism Exist?
Oh, it's a short book on a big question. The Templeton Foundation and Templeton Press and Yale University Press are starting a series of books, short books on big questions. And so they approached me with the idea of one on altruism, even suggested the title, but I left it the opportunity because I think that there's a new synthesis at hand, basically. It's possible to write a short book on this big question. And I call it a post-resolution account for the evolution of altruism. So in 150 pages, I'm able to say a lot, basically, on what I think is a new synthesis, if you like, on the evolution of altruism, which means not just highly sacrificial behaviors, but really has to do with the functional organization of groups. How groups work well is as much a topic of the book as highly sacrificial behavior.
Okay, and so by post-resolution, you mean after the resolution of a debate between group selectionists and individual selectionists, which you would say has been decided in your favor, but individual selectionists might say otherwise.
No, it's more interesting than that. It's not that one side won.
Okay.
It's this concept called equivalence.
But they don't agree with you about that either, right? So
they do. That's to be continued. But no. Let me, Robert.
They just don't know it.
What's that?
They just don't know they agree.
They do know it. This is why we need another episode. But let me just take one more step. Equivalence is the idea that two theories are like different perspectives or different languages. They're examining the same elephant in the room, the same causal process. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, they deserve to coexist. Mm-hmm. It's not the case that one will win over the other. Okay, so the resolution of the group selection controversy is that it's not either or. Kin selection or inclusive fitness theory and group selection are these different perspectives. So you have to understand equivalence in order to understand the post-resolution count. I have a whole chapter on equivalence. But having said that now, we can make some statements about the evolution of altruism upon which all reasonable people should be able to agree. And I do make that claim in my book. Okay. You're smiling.
Because your definition of a reasonable person may be someone who agrees with you, but don't we all define reasonable person that way? So who am I to complain about that?
It's well, I mean, if science is, I guess I don't want to invoke the science card too many times, but take a well-accepted fact. Take a really well-accepted fact, like mountains existed before people. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That is true.
I would have to say, if you don't accept that fact, you're not a reasonable person. It's not you agreeing with me. It's just that this is a very well-established fact, and it's well enough established so that people that don't necessarily agree with me on many, they've got to agree upon this, basically. Continents drift, Earth revolves around the sun, and altruism evolves in this particular way. And that's a strong claim, but I'm willing to defend it.
Well, certainly the group selectionists and individual selectionists would agree that those genes with properties most conducive to their own replication will flourish, and that's what happened with altruism. They'll agree. They'll go that far together, right?
Something like that.
Okay. So, well, good. Then we have plenty to talk about. We can have a whole other conversation on altruism, maybe.
Okay.
But this has been a good starter. So thank you, David. And I will take a closer look at This View of Life, the website you run.
Oh, yeah, it's a great place for this kind of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, take care.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.